What does it feel like when the people who were supposed to love you the most are the ones who make you feel the most invisible? And what happens when the whole country sees what they refuse to? My name is Sarah Bennett. I'm 33 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that if I just worked hard enough, achieved enough, became enough, my family would finally see me. I was wrong. But what happened next? I never could have predicted it. I grew up in a house that looked perfect from the outside. My father, Robert, was a senior financial director at one of Boston's most respected firms. My mother, Margaret, was a retired attorney who still carried herself like she owned every room she walked into. And then there was my sister, Claire, the golden child, the one who made partner at Harrington and Cross at 34, the youngest in the firm's history. In our family, success had one definition. It came with a title, a corner office, and a salary that made people lean in when you mentioned it at dinner parties. I was the one who didn't fit that definition. I was a teacher. For 9 years, I showed up every single morning to room 108 at Riverside Middle School in Boston. I taught 7th and 8th grade English to kids who didn't always believe words could save them, until they did. My apartment in South End was small. The bookshelves were overfull, and one entire wall was covered in handwritten thank you notes from students, some in careful cursive, some in crooked pencil from kids who'd never written a letter before me. On the hardest days, that wall was the only thing that reminded me I was doing something that mattered. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, I was erasing the whiteboard after the last bell when I noticed a thick envelope on my desk. Cream-colored paper, an embossed seal, the words that stopped my breath. National Teacher of the Year Selection Committee, U.S. Department of Education. I read the letter 3 times standing right there alone in that quiet classroom. I was one of 4 finalists in the entire country. The ceremony would be held in Washington, D.C. The Secretary of Education would present the award in person. It would be broadcast live on C-SPAN. I sat down slowly in my chair, holding that letter against my chest, listening to the sound of the school emptying out around me. For the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt seen. I rewrote that message to my family 13 times before I finally pressed send. The final version was simple. Just the facts, the date, the location, the official PDF attached with the Department of Education seal, clearly visible at the top. Then I waited. I made dinner. I graded papers. I checked my phone. I watched half of something on television I don't even remember. By midnight, all 3 of them had read the message. Not one of them had replied. I stared at the ceiling until 4 in the morning. Then, just after 7, my father's name appeared on the screen. My heart jumped. His message was 11 words. A teacher's award? I'm not flying to Washington for that. Before I could even process that, Claire responded, "Sorry, sis. Daniel and I already have plans. You get it, right?" And then, my mother. She didn't type a single word. She simply liked Claire's message and moved on. I set my phone down, picked it up, set it down again, then I typed back 4 words. "All good. Have fun." But just as I put the phone face down on the counter, a new notification lit up the screen. A private message from my mother. "Honey, we're throwing a little party for Claire next weekend to celebrate her making partner. Don't forget to bring that pumpkin bread everyone loves." I stared at that message for a long time. She had no words for the highest honor in American education, but she remembered exactly what I needed to bake for my sister's party. What my family didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that 48 hours later, the entire country would know my name. I didn't cry that night. I want you to understand that. I had stopped crying over my family a long time ago, not because the pain went away, but because at some point, the heart builds walls, not out of anger, but out of pure survival. So instead of tears, what came were memories. Quiet, uninvited, arriving one by one like old photographs falling out of a drawer. I thought about my master's degree graduation, 3 years of night classes while teaching full-time, writing papers at midnight after grading homework, running on coffee, and the belief that becoming better at my craft was worth every sacrifice. My parents arrived 90 minutes late. My father blamed traffic. My mother kissed my cheek and said, "We made it, didn't we?" They stayed for exactly 40 minutes before slipping out early. The next morning, I overheard my mother on the phone with my aunt. Her voice was bright and easy. "We made it to Claire's firm dinner last night. She looked absolutely stunning accepting her award. They had left my ceremony to get to Claire's event on time. They never told me. They never thought they needed to. Then I thought about my 31st birthday. Not one call. Not one text. 4 days later, my mother messaged, 'Wait, was your birthday last week? Time flies, honey. Let's do a makeup lunch soon.' That lunch never happened. I stopped waiting for it after the 3rd week. Last Christmas was the one that settled deepest. I told my family at dinner that my students at Riverside had raised $4,200 among themselves to build a small reading corner in the school library. Kids from families who clipped coupons and worked double shifts had given what little they had because they believed in something. I was so proud I could barely get the words out. My father nodded once, politely, the way you nod at a waiter who tells you the soup of the day, and then turned to Claire and asked what her year-end bonus was looking like. The conversation moved on without me, the way it always did. But the image I kept coming back to, the one I hadn't let myself think about in years, was the refrigerator at my parents' house. On it, framed behind glass, hung a photo of Claire receiving the Young Attorney of the Year award, her smile wide, my father's arm around her shoulders. And in the corner of the kitchen, half hidden behind a box of cookware, sat an old shoebox. Inside that shoebox were my report cards, my honor roll certificates, my letters of commendation, my teaching awards from the past 9 years. My mother had put them there to keep things, as she said, tidy. I was still sitting with all of that when my phone rang. The name on the screen stopped me cold. Eleanor Hayes. My grandmother. I answered immediately. Her voice was the same as it always had been, warm and unhurried, carrying the quiet authority of a woman who had spent 35 years as a school principal and transformed 3 failing schools into models of what education could be. She didn't say hello the way most people do. She simply said, "Did you tell your parents?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "Ah," she said softly, "I see." Then she told me something that made the room feel smaller. She said she had known about the nomination through old friends in education circles, people who had worked alongside her for decades, and then she said something I was not prepared for. "Sarah, I've been watching your career since the day you walked into your first classroom. Every student you fought for, every parent who told me you stayed late when no one asked you to. I submitted your name to the committee, but I waited. 5 years ago, I wanted to nominate you, and I didn't. Because you weren't ready yet. You hadn't found your own voice." I could barely speak. "Grandmother, you were the one who nominated me?" she answered without hesitation. "In 40 years, I have put forward 7 teachers. Every single one of them won. You are number 7. The silence that followed felt sacred. Then her voice shifted, just slightly, carrying something underneath it I couldn't quite name. "And Sarah, the night of the ceremony, there will be someone who takes the stage to speak about you, someone you may have forgotten." I leaned forward. "Who?" She paused, and I could hear the faintest smile in her voice. "You'll see. Now go work on your speech, sweetheart." She hung up. I sat there holding the phone with both hands, not moving. My grandmother knew something I didn't, and whatever it was, it felt like standing at the edge of something enormous, something I wasn't sure I was ready for, and yet something that had already been set into motion long before I ever sent that message to my family. 2 days after that phone call with my grandmother, my mother called and said Claire had some exciting news to share, and that the whole family should be together. I knew, even as I said yes, that I would probably regret walking through that door. But I went anyway. Some habits are older than our better judgment. The table was set the way it only ever got set for Claire's occasions. The white bone china that lived in the cabinet 11 months of the year. 2 red candles burning low in silver holders. A bottle of Bordeaux breathing in a crystal decanter at the center of the table. The kind of wine that doesn't get opened for just any evening. My father was already pouring when I walked in, and the moment I saw the bottle, I knew what kind of night this was going to be. He had been saving that wine for 18 years. Claire had officially made partner at Harrington and Cross. My father raised his glass before we had even taken our seats. His face carried the particular glow of a man whose whole chest had expanded with pride. "Claire," he said. Go ahead and tell everyone what this means. Claire shook her head with a smile and said, Dad, that's tacky. But then she set down her glass and added, let's just say that my bonus last month was more than some people make in a year. The table laughed. And then, almost as one, every pair of eyes drifted toward me. I kept my expression still. I had learned that trick a long time ago. My father turned to me with the easy, distracted energy of a man remembering something minor. So Sarah, that teacher thing of yours, when is that again? I looked at him steadily and said, Tuesday, Washington, D.C. The Secretary of Education presents the award in person. It broadcasts live on C-SPAN. He nodded slowly, the way you nod when someone tells you something you've already decided not to retain. Then Claire tilted her head with that particular smile and said, That's sweet. Hey, what do teachers make these days anyway? I told her. $54,000 a year. She glanced at her husband Daniel across the table and said, almost to herself but not quite, Huh, less than my quarterly bonus. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The table heard every word. What happened next was something I have thought about many times since. Daniel set his wine glass down quietly, turned toward me, and in a voice low enough that only I could hear, he said, The teacher who taught me to read in 2nd grade is the reason I didn't drop out. I think what you do is the most important work in the world. Then he picked his glass back up and looked away, as if the words had never left his mouth. I held that moment inside me like something fragile. In that entire house, in that room full of family, he was the only one who had said anything true to me all evening. I waited until I was putting on my coat at the door, then I turned back, kept my voice light, almost offhand, and said, Oh, I almost forgot to mention, the Department of Education covers everything for the finalists. First-class flights, car service, 5-star hotel. I watched the silverware stop moving. I watched my father's glass pause halfway to his lips. Claire's smile didn't disappear. It just became uncertain, like a signal losing its connection. I said, Enjoy the rest of your night, and stepped outside into the cold October air. The morning of my flight, 2 things happened before I even reached the airport. An email arrived from the CNN education desk requesting a pre-ceremony interview, and my principal, Dr. Patricia Owens, called to tell me that Riverside Middle School was setting up a live viewing in the main auditorium. She said, Sarah, we have never had a finalist for this award. This is a historic moment for every student in this building. I held the phone with both hands and didn't trust myself to say much more than thank you. The flight to Reagan National was the first time I had ever sat in first class. The seat reclined fully. Someone brought me sparkling water without me asking. A black car was waiting at arrivals with a card that said my name. The Madison Hotel had marble floors and a chandelier in the lobby that caught light, the way I imagined the inside of a diamond might look. The woman at the front desk said, Welcome, Ms. Bennett. Your suite is ready. Suite. Not room, suite. I set my bag down on the edge of the bed and sat there for a moment in the quiet, trying to make the room feel real. That evening I met the 3 other finalists at the reception. James Kowalski from New Mexico, Priya Anand from Michigan, and David Osei from Georgia. We were all a little overwhelmed, all slightly disbelieving, all laughing at the same things, in the way people do when the moment is too large to hold any other way. Later, scanning the official program for the ceremony, I found something I hadn't expected. Listed under special guests, in clear print, were the words, Eleanor Hayes, Guest of Honor. That night, my grandmother found me in the hotel lobby. She sat across from me in one of the wingback chairs near the window, her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at me with that steady, knowing calm she had always carried. Then she said something that followed me all the way up to my room and kept me awake until well past midnight. The person who will take that stage tomorrow to speak about you. You once told me you weren't sure he was going to make it to 20. While I stood behind the curtain at the Kennedy Center, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips, 300 miles north in Boston, my family was finishing their entrees at the Harlow and deciding what to order for dessert. My father raised his glass somewhere around 7:30 and said, This is what we're here for. This is the kind of achievement that makes a family proud. My mother reached across the table and squeezed Claire's hand. "I don't know what I did right to deserve a daughter like you," she said, and meant every word. Claire smiled the way she always smiled, when she was exactly where she believed she belonged. Then, almost as an afterthought, she glanced up and said, "Wait, isn't Sarah's little ceremony happening tonight?" My father made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Probably some conference room somewhere. A few dozen people, some cookies, a round of applause. Daniel said nothing. He set his fork down carefully and looked at his plate, and the muscle along his jaw tightened in a way that no one at that table noticed, or chose to notice. At the Kennedy Center, 2,400 people had taken their seats beneath crystal chandeliers that threw gold light across the entire room. American flags flanked the stage on both sides. Camera crews from every major outlet lined the back wall. My grandmother Eleanor sat in the front row in her navy blazer and pearl earrings, and her eyes were already red before the program had even begun. She had known this night was coming for years. I think in some ways she had been preparing for it longer than I had. The moment that changed everything came when a young man walked to the microphone. Jordan Williams was 29 years old, broad-shouldered and composed in a dark suit, a Johns Hopkins medicine badge clipped to his lapel. The room didn't know who he was yet. But I did. The second I saw his face, I stopped breathing. He looked out at the audience for just a moment before he spoke, and when he did, the entire hall went absolutely still. He said, "When I was 17 years old, I was sleeping in my car. My mother was serving a prison sentence. I hadn't showered in 4 days, and I walked into Ms. Bennett's English class that morning with one decision already made, that it would be the last day I ever came to school." He paused, and in that silence you could have heard the air moving. Then he said, "But she looked at me in a way that nobody had ever looked at me before. Not with pity, not with the kind of careful distance people use when they don't want to get involved. She looked at me like she could see something inside me that I had completely stopped believing was there." His voice was steady, but only barely. "She brought me food, and never once called it charity. She drove me to scholarship interviews before school started, when the parking lot was still empty and the hallways were dark. And when I got my acceptance letter from Johns Hopkins, the first person I called wasn't a friend or a relative. It was Ms. Bennett, because she was the first adult in my life who had ever genuinely believed I could become someone." His voice broke on that last word. Just slightly, just enough. He looked directly at me across that enormous room and said, "I am a pediatric surgeon today, and there is not a single day that passes where I don't know exactly why." 2,400 people rose to their feet at once. The sound was enormous. I stood at the edge of the stage with my hand pressed over my mouth, and I did not try to stop the tears. The Secretary of Education returned to the podium and held a cream envelope in both hands. The room settled back into silence, the particular silence of people who understand that what comes next matters. He broke the seal slowly, looked down at the card, and said, "The National Teacher of the Year for 2024 is Sarah Bennett, Boston, Massachusetts." Priya grabbed my arm. "Go," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Sarah, go right now." I walked out into the light with the crystal trophy, cold and solid in my hands, and for a moment, the applause was so large, it didn't feel like sound anymore. It felt like pressure, like warmth, like being held by something you couldn't see. Back in Boston, at 7:52 in the evening, my father reached for his phone out of habit, the way he always did between courses, to check the markets. A CNN alert sat at the top of his screen. He almost kept scrolling. Then he saw the photograph beneath the headline, and his hand went completely still. He said my mother's name in a voice I was told later she had never heard from him before. Low, strained, like something had been knocked loose inside him. He turned the screen toward her. Margaret took the phone and stared at it. Her face changed in a way that had nothing to do with the candlelight. Claire reached across and pulled the phone from her mother's hand, and in doing so knocked her glass of red wine across the white tablecloth, where it spread slowly outward like something that couldn't be taken back. She watched Jordan's testimonial play on the screen. She watched him describe a classroom, a teacher, a life that had been quietly and completely changed. When the clip ended, she set the phone down and said, in a voice I was told was almost unrecognizable, This is actually a really big deal." It was the first time all evening that the confidence had gone entirely out of her voice. The calls came fast after that. My father's golf partner. "Rich, why aren't you in Washington? Your daughter is all over CNN." A neighbor of my mother's. "Margaret, I'm sitting here crying. Sarah is absolutely extraordinary." And then a woman at a nearby table stood up, walked over, and asked quietly whether the woman on the news was their daughter. My mother said they hadn't been able to get flights. The woman looked at her for a moment and said, "It's a 5-hour drive from Boston." And she mentioned the one person who always believed in her. "That wasn't any of you, was it?" She walked away without waiting for an answer. In the restroom, Claire typed out a post with shaking fingers. Something about always knowing her sister would do something amazing. Something about family and pride. Within minutes, a comment appeared from Rebecca Thorne, a woman who had sat 3 seats from Claire at lunch earlier that week, a lawyer who had spent 5 years before her legal career covering education for the Boston Globe. Rebecca wrote simply, and without drama, that at lunch at Chez Laurent that same afternoon, Claire had referred to the award as a standard teacher appreciation event, and said her sister had no real future on a teacher's salary. She said she had been sitting right there. She remembered the exact words. 3 other women from that lunch added their agreement. Claire deleted the post, but the screenshot had already moved faster than she could follow, spreading across platforms in the particular unstoppable way that truth tends to do when it finally gets out. 2 days later, a senior partner sent a message saying their largest education nonprofit client had seen everything and had requested a different attorney for the $40 million case. The official reason given was a conflict of professional image. No further explanation was offered, because none was needed. And while all of that was unfolding 300 miles away, I was standing on the stage of the Kennedy Center, a crystal trophy in my hands, 2,400 people still on their feet. And for the first time in 33 years, I did not need a single person in my family to be in that room in order to know, completely and without question, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The teleprompter was ready. The prepared speech was loaded. Education funding statistics, carefully worded gratitude, the kind of polished language that looks good in a press release and disappears from memory the moment it ends. I looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then I looked out at 2,400 faces, at my grandmother in the front row with her hands pressed together, at the cameras sending this moment into living rooms across the entire country, and I set the prepared speech aside and said what was actually true. I told them that when I was growing up, I was told that teaching wasn't a real career, that I was wasting my potential, that success meant money, and that teachers were simply people who hadn't been able to make it anywhere else. A quiet stir moved through the audience, the kind that happens when a room full of people recognizes something they weren't expecting to hear said out loud. I found my grandmother's face in the crowd and held it. She had both hands over her heart, and her eyes were full. I said, "The one person who never stopped believing in me, the one who saw what I could become before I could see it myself, is my grandmother, Eleanor Hayes. Everything I am standing here for tonight belongs to her." She pressed her hands tighter against her chest and closed her eyes, and I had to look away or I would not have been able to continue. I told every teacher watching that their students would forget the grammar rules and the historical dates, but they would never forget what it felt like to have an adult in their life who truly saw them. And then I looked directly into the main camera and said, "To anyone who has ever been told they were not enough, that they would never amount to anything, I want you to hear this clearly. You are enough. Your worth is not something that belongs to the people who refuse to recognize it." The applause that followed lasted 4 full minutes. I stood at that podium and let it land, and I did not apologize for any of it. That night, alone in my hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed with the crystal trophy on the nightstand, and my phone face down on the comforter. 51 missed calls. My father, my mother, Claire. I did not listen to a single voicemail. Just before midnight, there was a soft knock at the door. My grandmother stood in the hallway in her hotel robe, her eyes still carrying the red of everything she had felt that evening. She came in and sat in the chair by the window, and we looked out together at the Washington Monument glowing white against the dark sky. After a long silence, she said, "I didn't arrange tonight to punish your family, Sarah. I arranged it to honor you." I started to say that I had just wanted them to show up, even once, just once. She said quietly, "They saw. And what they're feeling right now, every bit of it, is the result of their own choices. Not yours, never yours." The week that followed had its own kind of justice, the quiet kind that arrives without announcement. My father went to his regular Tuesday game at Pinehurst Country Club and was met not with the usual easy conversation, but with questions he had no good answer for. His oldest golf partner looked at him across the green and said, "Your daughter shook hands with the Secretary of Education on national television, Rich. Where exactly were you?" My mother left her book club early on Thursday because the women who normally talked about their latest read spent the first 20 minutes talking about my speech instead, and when she said they had watched from home, someone pointed out gently that Boston to Washington was a 5-hour drive, and Robert had made that trip for a golf tournament just the previous spring. Claire was formally removed from the $40 million education nonprofit case, required to complete a professional sensitivity course, and watched her carefully built reputation develop a crack that no press release was going to fill. 2 weeks after the ceremony, I drove back to my parents' house. Not because I needed their approval, not because I was ready to forgive and pretend. I went because I had something to say, and I was finally ready to say it without shaking. Claire looked at me when I walked in and said, "Fine. I'm sorry we didn't come. Are we done?" I told her I didn't need an apology. What I needed was for them to understand the difference between one missed event and 33 years of being treated like a footnote in my own family's story. My father said, "We are your parents. You can't just..." And I said calmly and without any anger left in it, "I can, and I am." I told them that from that point forward, I would show up when I was treated with genuine respect. I would answer calls when I felt like talking, and I would never again apologize for taking up space in a room. I walked to the door, turned back one last time, and said, "I'm not cutting you out. I'm just done shrinking myself down to fit the space you decided I was worth." Then I walked out into the cool air, and I did not look back. 6 months later, spring came to Back Bay, and I was living in a new apartment twice the size of my old one, bought with prize money I hadn't expected. Jordan sent me a text on a Tuesday morning that read, "Ms. Bennett, I matched in pediatric surgery at Stanford. You're the first person I'm telling before I post anywhere." I sat with that for a long time. I keynoted a national education conference in front of 3,500 teachers. I stood in the Rose Garden at the White House and shook hands with the president. And I was told later that my father had watched it on television, alone in his study, and that no one thought to ask him what he was thinking. One morning, I found an envelope on my kitchen table. Cream-colored paper, no return address, my father's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet. He had written, "Sarah, I was wrong about your career, wrong about what matters, wrong about you. I don't expect forgiveness. I just need you to know that I am sorry. Dad." I read it twice. I set it down on the table gently, the way you set down something that still has weight to it. Outside the window, the cherry blossoms along the street were just beginning to open, pale pink against a sky that was finally, after a very long winter, turning warm. I would write back, when I was ready, in my own time, on my own terms, because that is what it looks like when you finally stop waiting for someone else to decide you are worth something, and start living like you already know that you are. And if this story found you today, I hope you carry that with you. Your worth was never theirs to give, and it was never theirs to take away.